This is the second hearing for Bill SB 21. Our intention is to hear from the department. They've got about I've been told, about a 10-minute presentation. Where members would write their questions down and hold them to the end. And we'll then go back to the department with our questions. And then after that, we'll then bring Senator Jesse Keel and his staff to the table for questions as well. So up first is from DEC, we're going to have Tiffany Larson, Director of Spill Prevention and Response. And is Tiffany in the room or online? And Jeannie Curie, Department of Law. So whoever from DEC is presenting, please come to the table or online.
Good morning. This is Tiffany Larson, Director of Spill Prevention and Response from DEC. I am presenting telephonically from Anchorage this morning. Can everyone hear me?
We can.
Oh, fantastic. Good morning, Senators. So I'm here to talk to you about Senate Bill 121 and PFAS. So PFAS is a family of 5,000 to 10,000 man-made chemical compounds. They're carbon bonded to fluorine, which is one of the strongest bonds known to exist. They're water, oil, and heat resistant, water soluble, and persistent in the environment and bioaccumulate and magnify. And what I want you to know is while we have some concerns about the content of the bill, we appreciate Senator Keel bringing the attention to this very important subject. And what DEC has done in the absence of legislation to protect Alaskans and the environment is we've listed PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. In 2016, Alaska was one of the first states to promulgate soil and groundwater cleanup levels for two PFAS compounds. In 2019, we incorporated through our technical memo the use of a lifetime health advisory of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, individual or combined. And that's the threshold for which a responsible party has to provide alternative drinking water. And then since 2018, DEC and DOT have been voluntarily testing drinking water wells at airports required to use aqueous film-forming foam. And that effort continues through today. As part of that effort, we implemented expedited procedures to sample wells that were suspected of contamination, and where drinking water impacts were found, alternative drinking water has been provided. Additionally, EPA is actively working on this issue and published in fall of last year a strategic roadmap. They have a science advisory board reviewing some of the initial research documents for PFOS and PFOA that are likely to set a lower lifetime health advisory than the existing 70 parts per trillion right now. That draft report is expected to be released in May, so just next month. And that's anticipated to reduce the lifetime health advisory by an order of magnitude. So we're looking at going from a 70 parts per trillion individual or combined of PFOA or PFOS to something at or near 7 parts per trillion or lower. In the fall of this year, EPA expects to issue a proposed rulemaking for the National Primary Drinking Water Act regulations for PFOA and PFOS, with the final rule being in 2023. In winter of this year, they expect to publish their ambient water quality criteria and begin identifying PFAS in categories versus regulating on a compound-by-compound basis. As I told you before, 5,000 to 10,000 compounds in the PFAS family. One can imagine how long it would take to proceed through a level of scientific rigor with certainty for each of those compounds individually. So science is moving towards a categorical regulation. And then in the summer of 2023, EPA will have a final rulemaking designating PFOA and PFOS in CERCLA. And with that, I will transfer it to my co-presenter from the Department of Law, Jennifer Curie.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Curry. I'm with the Alaska Department of Law in Anchorage. I wanted to discuss 4 different legal issues with the bill. The first is that there are 2 distinct ways that DEC can identify a hazardous substance under state law. First, it can determine that a substance is hazardous based on the definition of hazardous substance under 4603-826. The second way is that it can list a hazardous substance in its promulgated regulations. In instances where DEC has made a determination that a substance is hazardous according to the definition but not by regulation, we have seen responsible parties try to eliminate their liability by arguing that it isn't in regulation and therefore isn't a hazardous substance. If we, through this bill, start to name hazardous substances through statute, it opens the door to responsible parties additionally trying to defeat liability by claiming that a valid determination of hazardous substance must be in statute. My second point is that under section 4603-350C of the bill, DEC is required to accept certain amounts of PFAS substances each year from the public. DEC must then dispose of the PFAS substances. Regardless of where DEC legally disposes of the PFAS it has collected, if at any point in the future that disposal site either has a release or is determined that the disposal site was not appropriate for PFAS disposal, that site could be deemed a contaminated site under either federal or state law. Because the state will then have disposed of PFAS at the site, we will be a liable party and will be held jointly and severally liable for addressing that contamination. My third point is related to 4603-345B. The United States enjoys sovereign immunity from suits just like the state does. For any waiver of sovereign immunity to be valid, Congress must be very specific about what it intends to waive, or courts will hold that the waiver has not occurred. Any provision that names a federal government liable under a state statute would be subject to challenge unless there is a valid waiver of sovereign immunity. Therefore, it's likely that the state would have to enter into costly litigation to attempt to hold the federal government liable under 345B because they required the release of PFAS. Finally, I would just point out that it's unclear whether the bill is declaring PFAS substances as hazardous substances under state law, as they are only referred to as PFAS substances. Just to note, DEC's liability statute only imposes joint and several liability on releases of hazardous substances. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tiffany Larson.
Thank you, Jen. So, Senators, what challenges exist for DEC with implementing the bill? First, there's not a database of where a FFF or aqueous film forming foam was used in the state, or a database of the quantities. There's also, as the Department of Law just attested to, significant liability to the state for ultimate disposal. There's no current mechanism by which DEC can accept, handle, or dispose of any amount of PFAS-containing substances. Yes.
Could you put your name back on the record and slow down a little bit? We're having trouble hearing you in Juneau. Put yourself back on the record.
Yeah, this is Tiffany Larson, Division Director, Spill Prevention and Response.
Okay. And then maybe just slow down a half a gear so we can hear. It's a little problematic hearing this, the conversation.
Certainly.
Okay. Please continue.
Yeah. So there's not a current mechanism by which DEC can accept, handle, or dispose of any amount of PFAS-containing firefighting substances. The monitoring requirements under air quality Title I permits would not be any different than under a Title V permit, and the bill would require DEC to apply unnecessary and expensive administrative procedures to a Title V permit without changing the underlying risk assessment or monitoring that would be required. DEC has the authority and has used it to require responsible parties to respond to PFAS contamination and to regulate hazardous substances. To statutorily declare any substance a pollutant could jump ahead of the science, and it also takes decision-making out of the hands of DEC's technical experts. We understand the concern that the public has regarding PFAS and the desire for clear lines of what is safe and not safe. The scientific community is still working to determine the critical levels of PFAS in our food, our drinking water, and our bodies. And this bill will not make that process happen any faster. And with that, I'm available for questions.
Senator Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wondering if we can get sort of Ms. Larson's, and I wasn't sure who was on for the Department of Law, if we can just get that in writing. It was sort of difficult to hear some of their testimony, and so just be helpful to get that in writing so we can just make better references to this piece of legislation before us.
Right, you're absolutely correct. And when they were finished, that's going to be the chair's request for the committee that we get their testimony in writing to the Finance Committee Co-Chair's office so we can distribute it to the committee members. Are you ladies finished with your presentation? Did I hear that?
Chairman, that's correct.
Okay. Questions from committee members? Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Larson, I guess one of the questions I have for you is that we're obviously facing a very significant chemical issue, and I like the idea that we have PFAS available to go ahead and put out fires, because to die in a fire is a very horrendous situation, having seen fire victims in my practice of medicine when I was doing that. But I guess my question to you is, what kind of alternatives do you propose in order for us to go ahead and make it so that the scourge on the future generations of Alaskans and our children and our grandchildren aren't significantly compromised, as we saw, say, with the asbestos situation that happened back in the 30s when shipbuilding became a big issue?
Senator through the chairs, I understand your question. It is there an alternative firefighting remediation substance or treatment substance available in lieu of AFFF?
That's not my question, Mr. Chairman. Can I repeat the question?
Please.
Ms. Larson, what I would like to know is what's your alternative to pressing ahead with legislation like this, because we can see there can be a scourge in the future.
Senator, through the chair, I don't have an alternative to pressing forward. What I would say is that it's important that we fall in line with the science and give our researchers the ability to find the best way to regulate these substances moving forward. As I said before, there are somewhere between 5 to 10,000 compounds in the PFAS family. And if we continue to try and do this on a compound by compound basis, you and I and our children will be having this conversation for the rest of their lives. And so the scientific community is putting a concentrated effort on investigating options moving forward. But one of those, and one of the most promising of those, is looking at these 5 to 10,000 compounds and saying, how can we categorize them to regulate them on a category? And then as we identify new ones, put them into their appropriate category based on the research to be best protective of human health and the environment. And so while I don't have an alternative in this moment, I think the correct path forward is to follow the science and let the categorization happen and figure out the best way to deal with each of these compounds as they affect everyone, as they're individually affect things differently.
If I can continue, Mr. Chairman.
Follow-up?
It's actually not a follow-up. It's actually a question for Ms. Curry with the Department of Law.
Yes.
Has to do with, you talked about the sovereign immunity, the differences between the state and the federal level, and those kind of issues. I guess one of the questions I have for you is, as you pointed out, this very complicated, tortuous pathway that we have to go to if we're going to be effective. I was wondering, what is your area of expertise as far as the practicing law?
Senator Olson, through the chair, I have been practicing law at the Department of Law in the environmental section for 17 years. Before that, I practiced in Boston in environmental law for 5 years, and before that in litigation for approximately 7.
Thank you very much for that history on your past. I guess, as you see it, what is the best avenue to go ahead and go down this pathway to protect the public from a public policy standpoint, and how do we make sure that the generations after are protected?
Senator Olson, to the chair, I am very prepared to talk about legal issues, but I have a feeling that lends more itself to the policy side of things and what avenues we take as a state, and I think that the agency is better equipped to answer those questions.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think that the issue that some of these people that have voiced opposition to this bill have pointed out to me is that I don't see any alternative, that we have to go ahead with putting state statutes in place, because that's the only thing we have at our disposal in order to try and make it so that we are starting an effect, so that 20 years from now, we're not looking back and said, you know, back when I was in the legislature, I wish I'd done something to try and stop this, these disease issue processes that go on out there and we're seeing in the public. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Wielechowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard DEC say that PFAS was listed by the state as being hazardous. What hazards did you find were associated, or did the department find were associated with the exposure to PFAS?
That'd be to Ms. Larson.
Yes, Senator Wielechowski through the chair. So the department once it lists it as a hazardous substance, we take the toxicological data, the human health toxicological data, and use that to list PFAS or other compounds. The list is relatively long of hazardous substances. And what that allows us to do is regulate it and then talk about ultimate disposal options.
Senator Wielechowski, follow-up?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a gauge, though, on how hazardous does the department believe this is? What kind of human health problems does this exposure to PFAS cause?
Senator Wielechowski, through the chair. I don't have a list in front of me of the potential human health problems. We use EPA's and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry's assessment, which is an external agency to the state, for a list of those problems. And I'm happy to provide that in follow-up with the committee in writing.
Follow-up, Senator Wielechowski?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, if the department listed it as hazardous, I would assume they listed it as hazardous because it's hazardous to human health in some way. I'd be interested in seeing what the department believes that those hazards are. My other question is for the Department of Law, and there was a concern expressed over 4603 345B in that you could get potentially involved in litigation against the federal government. What agencies of the federal government require a release of firefighting substances containing PFAS currently?
Senator Wielechowski through the chair. In my limited understanding, I believe that the FAA required testing of PFAS substances at federally certified airports, I believe.
Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question is for Ms. Larson. What would you say is the current mapping of the state of Alaska in terms of contaminated sites? Do you think we have it mapped out at 90%, 100%, 85%?
Yeah, Senator Wilson, through the chair. I would say we have a map available to the public on our website that anyone can access at any time, identifying all contaminated sites across the state of Alaska. And upon reporting, those contaminated sites end up on that database. So we have 100% mapped of the sites we know about.
And if
Follow-up?
what do you think is about the number of sites that you don't know about? Just do you think you have it mapped out at 80% of the sites that you figured in the state of Alaska?
Senator Wilson, I could not possibly, through the chair, I could not possibly speculate on what I do not know. I would say that once we know about them, we map them, and that's the best we can do. And we know about them through various means. When people report spills, we follow that up to see if there's longstanding contamination. But we have to find out about it to map it.
Other questions? I'm going to bring Senator Keel and his staff to the table. Senator Keel, would you like to make some comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity. For the record, Jesse Keel, Senator for Senate District Q. With me is Catherine Schlingheide, my staff. This has been a great conversation this morning, and I very much appreciate the DEC's contributions to it. I think, I hope nobody got the wrong impression in the initial presentation of the bill. DEC has made some movement over the years. The problems that we have arise from two things. One is that the levels where they have set 2 substances only are simply much higher than the levels where we know they hurt people's health. It was a great part of the discussion when one of the folks on the line from DEC suggested that our best way to protect people's health is to list thousands of these chemicals by class at lower levels. I'm inclined to agree, but that's not the bill we brought before you, because the science, the research that is out there is crystal clear on these substances, and there remain, as you heard in the testimony from DEC, some questions about listing a class. This bill brings you the substances about which there simply is no question left. Mr. Chairman, I think it's also important to note that nothing in the bill stops DEC from setting lower limits or from regulating classes of chemicals.
To that point, Senator,
Please.
because I believe I heard, and it was hard for me to hear, Ms. Larson, I wish the administration would have been here in person. I think we could have had a better conversation. But I thought I heard her say that by May, it appears that it's going to go from 70 parts per trillion to 7 parts per trillion. Now, if I misspoke, somebody correct me, including Ms. Larson.
Mr. Chairman, I defer to DEC on predicting what the EPA will do. She did talk about an order of magnitude, so I think your numbers work. This bill, of course, comes in at roughly that type of reduction, right? For the 2 substances in question, this sets one at 8 parts per trillion, another at 16. Again, that would be the highest limit Alaska could allow. And as the research shows even more risk, they could go lower. I think, Mr. Chairman, there are just a couple of other things that I thought were really interesting in the conversation. One is that I do object a little bit to the department's notions that the legislature should never declare anything hazardous by statute. We do that all the time. If you look through the DEC statutes, we declare crude oil in uncontrolled release to the environment hazardous, just as we should. We declare DDT and some other pesticides hazardous. That's perfectly appropriate. We know they are. And so on. The TBT-based hull paint that was killing fish. Legislature took care of that by statute. This is not a novel approach. This is not a brand new thing. And while I am sure that potentially responsible parties might come to court with an argument about other pollutants, as we heard from the Department of Law, that if they're not listed in one way, they can't be a pollutant. I think the Department of Law will also tell you that those arguments have been unsuccessful in the past. So I guess they don't worry me too much that someone might bring an unsuccessful argument again. But I certainly would defer to the Department of Law in the history there. I haven't looked at every single case. Mr. Chairman, the question of whether the bill should speak to federal agencies that required these releases being jointly and severally liable is something that we discussed, as you'll recall, significantly in the Resources Committee. Members of the Resources Committee felt strongly that our law should say the people who required spilling this stuff in the environment should share that joint and several liability. That doesn't reduce the state's ability to cover these costs of clean drinking water for Alaskans from other parties. And as to the cost of the lawsuits, I know that this committee has talked many times about what the state of Alaska spends in our challenges to the federal government, our little back and forth with our dear friend, Uncle Sam. Including that provision in Senate Bill 121 is not significantly different than many other things we've done that challenge wrongdoing by the federal government. I'll just leave these remarks with one last thing. There are other provisions in this bill that are very important, and they won't be solved when EPA eventually, someday, as we heard Mr. Laddick, former Director Laddick, talk about in the initial presentation, someday gets around to a more protective health standard. Things like the protection for local fire departments and their liability. Things like the phase out for our oil and gas industry. As Senator Olson said, Mr. Chairman, there are safe replacements for these PFAS foam, firefighting foams, for everything out there except the oil and gas industry. And this bill, of course, gives the fire marshal the ability to only trigger the phase out when there's a safe alternative. But the last thing I'll leave you with is that take back, up to 25 gallons. That's going to cover our very smallest all-volunteer fire departments. It's going to cover those code red cards that this legislature, that this body put out in very small rural communities to save lives, and give them a way to get rid of that PFAS-containing foam. The state of Alaska has a lot of PFAS-containing foam. 25 gallons from a little fire department here and there is just going to add to the tremendous stockpiles that DOT has at state airports that they're going to warehouse until there's a safe way to destroy this stuff. We already have it, Mr. Chairman. This is nothing new. More than happy to take any other questions from the committee.
Seeing no questions from committee, anybody else from the department want to have any closing comments before we set an amendment deadline and set this bill aside? Seeing none, amendment deadline Friday, April 22nd, 5 p.m. Going to set this bill aside. Next
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
is SB 199. This is the third hearing for SB 199. Our intention is to cover fiscal modeling. Mr. Painter, I believe your slides are updated. I just want to take just a quick brief at ease while you're getting situated.
Wow, it just never seems to end when it comes to those sitting down there in Juneau, how much they want to continue to change things and take things and rip us off. Looks like you may have gavelled back in there.
And proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Alexi Painter, Legislative Finance Division, and I believe Connor Bell should be online as well for any additional questions.
He is.
Great. So we're going to review our modeling baseline assumptions, go over some different assumptions from the Senate Finance Committee, slightly different than the last time we were in front of the committee to reflect changes in the budget since then. And then we'll go over some fiscal modeling. So our fiscal model is designed to show policymakers the long-term impact of fiscal policy decisions. Essentially, our baseline assumptions are that we will maintain the current budget levels adjusted for inflation, and then you can apply policy changes against that baseline. And our default is to assume that statutory formulas will be followed, including the PFD and school debt reimbursement and other items. On the revenue side, our baseline assumptions are based on the Department of Revenue spring revenue forecast that assumes $101 oil in FY23 following the futures market after that. It assumes the DNR oil production forecast, which projects that Alaska North Slope crude production will increase from about 500,000 barrels a day in FY23 to 576,000 by FY31. And for the permanent fund, we're using Callan's return assumption of 5.86% in FY22 and then 6.2%. One thing I'd note really quickly on the spring forecast, it's about a month old at this point. If you look at the futures market today, it's very close to that spring forecast. There's been a little bit of flattening where it doesn't decline quite as quickly, but is a little bit of a lower starting point, but it's still very close, within a couple of % of the forecast. So we think that the spring forecast is still an appropriate forecast to use at this point. On the spending side, so our baseline assumption is based on the governor's amended budget and growing with inflation. For statewide items, again, we're assuming that all items are funded to their statutory level. And that includes school debt reimbursement, the REA fund, community assistance, oil and gas tax credits, and the PFD. For the capital budget, we assume the governor's FY23 amended capital budget growing with inflation. And then for supplementals, our assumption is $50 million per year, which is based on a historical average. And again, statutory PFD is in the baseline. So here's a model of our baseline on slide 6. So just to orient you on these slides, and I know the committee's aware, but mostly for the members of the public, at the top we have the surplus deficit in millions, so starting with FY22 and going through FY31. The black numbers there indicate that we would have surpluses in fiscal years 22 through 24, and then projected deficits from FY26 and beyond. On the bottom left, you can see the budget and revenue. The bars represent revenue. Blue is the traditional revenue from petroleum and non-petroleum sources. Green is the percent of market value draws. And then the other colors are various different types of draws from savings accounts. Most notably in yellow, that's the CBR or SBR draw, which are our main savings accounts. And then on the right are the savings accounts balances. These are end-of-year balances. The yellow is the CBR and SBR combined. The green is the realized value of the ERA, the spendable portion of the permanent fund. And so what this slide shows is that with a statutory PFD, that would pay about $4,200 per person in FY23. There would be a surplus based on the governor's amended budget of about $700 million. But by FY25, there would be a deficit as oil prices are projected to decline in those years. So that would leave us with a deficit starting at about $300 million and then changing between $500 and $800 million in the subsequent years. However, because there's these surpluses in early years, that allows the savings accounts balances to grow a bit. So up to about $5 billion by the first year. And so even with those deficits, we wouldn't need ERA overdraws to make this scenario. Okay, moving on to the Senate Finance Committee baseline, budget assumptions, which are a bit different. So yesterday, when we went over the fiscal summary, we used $400 million as one of the numbers for the capital budget. These scenarios use that $400 million instead of the governor's $195.4 million or the $213 million that's currently in the Senate budget. So it's a bit higher, accounting for some items that may come in the future. The next change that will be pretty significant actually when we're looking at some of the probabilistic modeling is that all oil revenues resulting from Alaska North Slope oil prices above $100 a barrel are deposited into the corpus of the permanent fund. That was a change that was introduced in the operating budget adopted yesterday. And so if you look at just the straight line models, that only has an impact in FY23 when prices are projected to be $101 a barrel. So there's a $1 difference there that goes into the permanent fund. When we're looking at the probabilistic, you may see that kind of at the top of the range, it flattens out a bit in terms of the surplus size. And that's because at a certain point, the surpluses from oil being very high just get deposited in the permanent fund. And so that it sort of compresses the top of the range there when we get to those slides. For the agency operations, we're assuming the Senate committee second Senate committee substitute for the FY23 operating budget. And then these will grow at 2.25% in the base scenarios. There's also a budget stress test scenario that grows at 5%. And for comparison, that 5% growth is roughly equivalent to the amount that the Senate CS grows versus the FY22 budget. So it's sort of if you kept growing at the rate that this budget grows. We assume that expiring federal funds are replaced with UGF in future years and that PERS healthcare is funded after FY23. In the CS, the PERS healthcare funding for FY23 is actually deposited into the pension fund, but this assumes that it would go into the healthcare fund in future years. And then there's varying PFD scenarios that we'll go through. First is the statutory PFD. The second is 50% of the percent of market value draw. That's essentially the governor's proposal. And then there will be Senate Bill 199 with both the trigger passing and failing. So this bill has a dividend amount that will change based on a triggering mechanism. So it will either be 25% of the percent of market value draw, or if $800 million of new revenue is enacted, then it will go back to 50%. So we'll show both if the $800 million of new revenue happens and if it doesn't. And then one assumption is that we assumed that if there's deficits, first we fill them by reducing the amount of money in the public education fund for K-12 forward funding, and then draw from the CBR and SBR. And that was sort of what the legislature did in FY15 when we had a deficit emerge mid-year, is consume both the SBR and K-12 forward funding. So, just to review again the CS2 budget, there's a few significant changes from the governor's budget to be aware of when we're comparing the scenarios between the baseline scenario and the SCS and the Senate scenarios. There's a supplemental appropriation to oil and gas tax credits, also to school debt reimbursement and the REAA fund. There's forward funding of K-12, and again, we'll assume that funding would be reduced as a deficit filler if necessary. There's a $27 million UGF increase to offset state agencies' increased fuel costs. And then the CS uses $300 million of ARPA revenue replacement, which is the American Rescue Plan. One of the uses of that federal funding is to replace lost UGF revenue. And so the CS adopted yesterday uses $300 million of revenue replacement in the current year, FY22, and then the remaining $186.6 million of that fund is used for that same purpose in FY23, essentially turning that federal money into balances in the savings accounts. Okay, going on to slide 9. This is a fiscal summary. Again, you saw this yesterday, but for members of the public, showing with Senate Committee Substitute 2 of the operating budget, as well as that $400 million assumption for the capital budget, and then the 50-50 permanent fund dividend here on line 16. And so SB 199 would have a 50-50 dividend. So 3 of the 4 scenarios we're going to run start with that 50-50 PFD and FY23. So just the important numbers to know on this fiscal summary are the pre-transfer surplus deficits, kind of that ongoing surplus amount. In FY22, that'd be $937 million. In FY23, that ongoing surplus would be $43 million, so roughly a balanced budget. Then there's some use of savings that generate, or one-time monies and savings that generate additional surplus. Excuse me. In FY22, that results in a $1.2 billion post-transfer surplus. And then in FY23, a bit over $200 million. And over on the right, you can see the reserve balances. So the SBR ends FY23 at just shy of $2 billion. The CBR at about $1.5 billion. So combined, about $3.5 billion in those two savings accounts. When you add that to the K-12 forward funding, that's essentially $4.7 billion of liquid savings that could be used to fill future deficits. Slide 10 shows a comparison of that Senate finance scenario, so kind of what we just showed on that last page, to the LFD baseline. And again, the LFD baseline essentially represents the governor's budget growing with inflation. In FY23, that major difference, that $1.7 billion, is due to K-12 forward funding in part. That is an added $1.2 billion. It's a one-time cost, really savings, but it's counted as spending kind of for technical reasons. On an ongoing basis, the assumption difference is about $450 million of additional spending. About half of that's on the capital side and half on the operating side.
Senator Von Imhoff?
Thank you. So, Alexi, just to confirm, the baseline blue is the governor's budget. Does that include, just to confirm, all the different amendments that have been eked out over the last 4 or 5 months?
Through the chair, Senator Von Imhoff, yes. That includes the infrastructure bill and the amendments we just got for the salary adjustments in GGU.
Okay, to confirm, the infrastructure bill that we saw yesterday. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Senator Wilson, did you have a question?
Mr. Chair, I just had the same question if the infrastructure dollars were in all the scenarios that were coming through. So that was just answered. Thanks.
Mr. Painter?
All right, continuing on to slide 11. So this just shows oil prices in the current fiscal year to date. Just as a reminder about the spring forecast. So I think when we first saw the spring forecast, it was at a bit of a peak, and we've seen oil prices have been extremely volatile since then. Going anywhere from the $120 a barrel to the 90s. Earlier in the year, the prices were significantly lower, and then you can see a ramp up before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It started to ramp up into the 90s, and then since then it's been extremely volatile as those events have gone on. And so when we're looking at these fiscal modeling scenarios, the spring forecast essentially assumes that prices will return over time towards that sort of pre-war version that, within a few years, prices will be back in the 70s or so. And so essentially you can view this at the very end of the year here as a temporary blip, most likely. And then over time, we should get back to the 70s or 80s based on what the futures market says. As we look at the kind of the volatility scenarios, you'll see scenarios with, oil significantly higher than that 125 that it hit this year, and also significantly lower than the lows this year as well.
Senator Von Imhoff.
Thank you. So this slide is good. It starts, however, though, in July of 2021. And of course, if we had put 2 years prior to that, we would see even more volatility with the price of oil hovering in 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera. So I think it's just important to put on the record that volatility is pretty commonplace with the price of oil. And we can see just now how much money we have to spend now compared to 2-3 years ago.
Senator Von Imhoff, that's a great point. If you go back, 2 years ago, we had oil that briefly was zero, and now, 2 years later, it touched $125 a barrel. So when we're looking at some of these volatility scenarios and the probabilistic modeling, I think people say, oh, it's unrealistic that oil could swing from $30 to $140, but we've seen that in the last 2 years. It's quite possible that could happen very quickly. We don't know what geopolitical events would cause that in the future, but it does happen and has happened.
Follow up?
Okay, thank you. Can we just go back to the previous slide, number 10? I'm sorry if I have slow twitch brain muscles here, but just looking at fiscal year 23 with the red line being much higher than the blue line, I think what's important, and the co-chairs can help me out with this, but I think what the Senate Finance CS2 includes, and meaning the governor's budget did not include, was fully funding REAA, fully funding community assistance, deferred maintenance, things of that nature. I mean, it is a larger red line, but I think what's important is that the governor did not fund a lot of these things. And this table has so far, and it's in its CS2, have added funding that has not been funded for many years. Is that correct?
Yes. And there's also 22 supplemental in this red line too, I believe.
Mr. Chairman, the supplemental is not included. The big difference here is that K-12 forward funding of $1.2 billion. If you take that out, it's more $400 to $500 million of additional spending. And a lot of that is, I think the largest item would be using unrestricted general funds for the Marine Highway. And then the larger capital budget that, of course, we haven't actually seen that larger budget, but the committee asked to use $400 million versus the governor's $192 million. So that's about half the difference. And then half the difference would be those operating items, most notably the Marine Highway.
Okay, so just to confirm, thank you. To confirm, it's $1.2 billion for forward funding of education, which is the largest chunk of that. So that makes sense. I appreciate you pointing that out. So thank you.
All right, continuing on to slide 12. So with these models, we have essentially each scenario, we have three models. We have one that's just the base case, a linear model, and then we have two stress tests. One is the budget stress test, and that assumes that the agency operations and the capital budget grow by 5% a year instead of the inflation assumption of 2.25%. And that's based on the growth in this CS compared to last year's budget is about 5.3%. That's where that number came from. And also based on, if you look at inflation over the last couple of years, it's been in the 4 to 5% range, or the last year. So that may be in the short term a more realistic inflation number to use. Then there's a revenue stress test, which we use probabilistic modeling to simulate a range of possible oil prices and investment returns, and then show the result of that. And that will show, if we had sort of negative scenarios or positive scenarios, what would that do to our reserve balances and budget? And then for each of these PFD scenarios, we'll have the non-stress model output and then the two stress tests. And for the stress tests, here's an example of what a 25th percentile example could look like. I think it's helpful to see this to know, when we say, okay, the 25th percentile, that means, this for the deficit. What does that actually mean? And this is an example of a single model where 25% of the scenarios in that stress test show greater overall deficits and 75% show less, smaller overall deficits. And so in this example, the average oil price is $77, which is, actually pretty close to the 50th percentile. But if you look at that volatility, there's an extremely high price in the current year, then it drops down to, somewhere in the 40s to 60s, and then has a high price in the last year. So even though the overall average price may be, $77, pretty reasonable assumption, the average deficit is actually going to be somewhat larger in this scenario. And the same thing in the average permanent fund return. This scenario has an average permanent fund return of 7%, which is actually better than the baseline, which is 6.2%. But it's extremely volatile and a little lower in the early years. So this particular scenario, there's a pretty good return in FY23, but then essentially 3 straight pretty bad years, although 5% is not terrible, it's below the expectation, but a negative year and then 2 subpar return years. So even though there's some decent years later on, that reduces the value of the permanent fund and hurts the total value. So sometimes when you're looking at these, the sequence of returns for the permanent fund is actually quite important. Just doing a straight line average and saying, well, the average investment return is 6.2% in the Callan forecast, the actual impact of that on the value of the permanent fund is going to depend on the sequence. If you have a recession earlier on, that's going to be more damaging than one later on. And so I think this is a really interesting example of a 25th percentile result, which is not very good, but the averages are pretty good. So it's really just that oil volatility and then the sequence of returns are not favorable. And so I think it's just an interesting illustration of how, the deterministic modeling where we're just taking a straight line forecast can maybe be misleadingly positive sometimes versus what the actual impact of volatility in the real world. So going on to slide 14, so this is the statutory PFD. We had the statutory PFD earlier with the LFD baseline assumptions. This is with the Senate Finance Committee assumptions. And I'm going to, again, kind of orient you to the slide briefly and then turn it over to Mr. Bell if he's still in line to talk about some of the specifics. And so, again, similar to the earlier slides, we have the surplus deficit and then those two graphs. The other additional items on the bottom here, it shows the actual cost of the PFD in this scenario and then the amount per person. So just to give a reference as we're changing PFD scenarios going forward. And then I think if Mr. Bell could go through the specifics of this scenario.
Good morning, Mr. Bell. Are you with us?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, this is Connor Bell with Legislative Finance Division.
You're up. Good morning.
Great, thanks. So this scenario showing the statutory PFD with the 2.25% growth for agency operations and capital budget shows a deficit of $1.1 billion in FY23, and that's higher in the next couple of years, largely because of that $1.2 billion in K-12 forward funding that was discussed earlier. And since the reducing of the K-12 forward funding is the first line of filling deficits, you can see in FY23 that gray bar towards the top is starting. So the entire $1.2 billion is shown in that year as an expenditure, and then several hundred million of that is then used to fill deficits in FY23. That the brown bar above it is the ARPA revenue replacement, which is filling the first few hundred million of that $1.1 billion pre-transfer deficit. And then after FY23, there's smaller deficits for the next couple of years, but DOR's revenue forecast trends downwards for the first several years. And so you see the deficits start to grow. And beginning in FY28, according to this modeling, unplanned ERA draws begin, which is drawing from the earnings reserve account beyond the percent of market value draw. And on the right, you can see the CBR, SBR, and the realized ERA balances. The CBR hits the minimum $500 million in FY27, and that's why you start to see those ERA overdraws beginning FY28.
Next one on the next slide, 15.
Moving on to slide 15, this is showing the exact same thing as the prior slide, with the exception of the assuming that budgets grow at 5% instead of 2.25%. So that's the agency operations and the capital budget growing at 5% per year. So the FY23 budget is the exact same as the prior slide, and the differences between the two slides grows over time since that 5% growth rate is compounding. And the deficits grow significantly up to 2.2 billion by the end of the term period. The K-12 forward funding reduction fills the FY23 through part of the FY25 deficits, and then the CBR and SBR are relied on until FY27 when you begin to see ERA overdraws. The realized ERA balance falls to about $7 billion by FY31 due to the sustained overdraws from that fund.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Von Imhoff.
Thank you. So, Mr. Bell, I think the slides 14 and 15, looking at the two and showing the inflation, what the takeaway for me is that when you said inflation is compounded, and especially if it's just the growth rate is higher from 2.5% to 5%, we can't ignore inflation. It looks to me that it does have a significant impact on expenses, like you said, with compounded. And this definitely reminds me the importance of inflation proofing the permanent fund corpus. And I think that we should look at what inflation growth rates are, and they have been more than 2.5% or 2.25% in the last many months. And I think that it's wise to be modeling different inflation rates because it is material. So I thank you, Mr. Bell and Mr. Painter, for doing that. And this is impactful to me. Thank you.
Mr. Bell, please continue.
All right, thank you. Moving on to slide 16. This is showing the statutory PFD in the probabilistic scenario. And I believe Mr. Painter may talk through the details of the slide since he's there in person.
Sure. For the record, Alexi Painter, Legislative Finance. So I'll just kind of orient you to this slide. I think, it's been a couple of months since the committee looked at these. So on the top, we still have the median surplus or deficit, in this case, deficits each year. The left graph here, shows the surplus deficits by fiscal year, but instead of sort of the way on the it was on the previous slide, these ones use probabilities. So the blue lines in the middle, the blue bar represents the median scenario. The green bars represent the 25th and 75th percentile scenarios. And then the black line represents the 10th and 90th percentiles. So we'd expect that, the vast majority of scenarios are going to fall within the line. And as I mentioned earlier, you notice in FY23, there's kind of a bunching up at the top here where the median and the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile, the median, and the 75th percentile are all in the same place. That's because of the impact of that $101 a barrel, or the $100 a barrel draw into the permanent fund. So anything with oil revenue higher than $100 a barrel goes in the permanent fund. And that causes these to compress because all those scenarios are with prices greater than 100. Since the baseline forecast going on is for prices to reduce, that doesn't quite compress as tightly in the next ones, but that is that reason for the compression in the beginning. The graph on the right shows the range of the fiscal year ending realized ERA balances. So again, the blue line in the middle is the median, the green line is the 75th and 25th percentile, and then the black line is the 10th and 90th percentile. At the bottom, we have the probabilities of the CBR and SBR balance being at least a certain amount, or below a certain amount, sorry. So the top here shows the CBR and SBR balance, the probability that there is less than 4 billion combined in the CBR and SBR. So in FY23, there's a 100% probability that it's below, their combined values are below 4 billion. By FY31, it's 90%. And then the other probability is that the CBR or SBR would be below 500 million. And for these models, we assume that if there's not, that we would maintain at least 500 million. So essentially in those scenarios, we have to overdraw the ERA. So this can also be read as the probability of an ERA overdraw. In FY23, it's fairly low, 21%, but going forward, it increases as the sort of revenue risk increases to somewhere around 60%. I may have covered all the content on here, but if Mr. Bell has anything to add before we move on, I'll let him go ahead.
I believe Chair Painter has covered everything.
Next slide, please.
Great. Again, for the record, this is Connor Bell, Legislative Finance Division. Slide 17 shows we're going to go through those same three scenarios, except for the 50-50 PFD, which is half of the percent of market value draw from the permanent fund. And the first slide shows the baseline 2.25% growth annually in agency operations and capital budget. The FY23 budget is roughly balanced. Note that, I believe Mr. Painter mentioned this earlier, but note that we assume $50 million of supplementals in FY23, which wouldn't show up in the fiscal summary. So that it slightly differs in that way. And again, the FY23 has higher spending, so the FY24 actually sees a significant surplus, and then those start to fall into deficits beginning FY26. The forward funding reduction is sufficient to cover the deficits through FY28, and then CBR and SBR draws begin then in FY29. There are no overdraws from the ERA in this scenario. So you can see on the right that the combined balance of the CBR, SBR, and realized ERA is over $20 billion by the end of the period.
Senator Wilson has a question, Mr. Bell.
Not just a question, just a comment that just with the 50-50, if we can just hold the budget low and with modest revenues, this could actually work under this scenario.
Wait till we get to the next slide. Mr. Painter? And Connor Bell?
Thank you, Chair. This slide 18, moving on, is showing the same 50-50 PFD, except with the 5% annual growth in agency operations and capital instead of the 2.25% growth on the slide before. So again, the FY23 deficit is the same, 12 million or roughly balanced budget. And then you see the deficit start to grow. And this is, based on the different compounding spending growth. You see much larger deficits. And of course, it's a policy call as to how deficits will grow and whether they will grow. But in this scenario, assuming those compounding 5% returns, you see deficits grow to over $1 billion by FY28 and then up to 1.6, 1.7 billion by the end of the period. Due to the healthy or the significant reserves balance in the earlier period, the POMV or the ERA is only overdrawn in the last 2 years. So you can see the CBR and SBR and forward funding reduction filling those deficits through FY29.
Okay, next slide. Mr. Painter, I believe you take those. Is that right?
I'll actually let Mr. Bell cover this one as well, so if that's okay.
That's fine. Mr. Bell?
Thank you. Again, for the record, Connor Bell, Legislative Finance Division. This is showing the revenue stress test that Mr. Painter spoke to a few slides before. So the median surplus and deficit is similar to what was shown 2 slides before. But once you get into later years, it differs. As Mr. Painter mentioned in the slide on the left, you see that the median and 25th percentile or 75th percentile are roughly the same. And that's because we're assuming that any oil price revenue over $100 is deposited into the principal. And so that is that first year is the only year when the median oil price or the DOR's forecasted oil price is over $100 a barrel at 101. And after FY23, there's about 50% of the scenarios we modeled saw somewhere between roughly $1 billion to $1.2 billion in deficits, ranging to about 500 million to 1.5 billion in surpluses. So that's about the range where we saw 50% of the cases, and the other 50% of cases were outside of those 2 lines. So in excess of either $1 billion deficits or more than 500 to 1.5 million in surpluses. And on the right, the median realized ERA balance is slowly declining. At the 25th percentile, you see the earnings reserve account go to 0, the realized balance by FY31. And just to note that even in the absence of any ERA overdraws, at the 25th percentile in our modeling, we're seeing the realized ERA balance get pretty close to 0. And that's just because in those more negative scenarios, we're If the PFD sees poor returns for several years in succession, with the combination of $3 to $4 billion in POMV draws and the $1 billion to $1.5 billion annually in inflation proofing, that's sufficient in a poor market scenario to bring that realized ERA down to zero. So it doesn't necessarily require any ERA overdraws for that event to take place. It just makes it less likely. And at the 75th percentile, you see the balance of the realized ERA growing up to and beyond $30 billion. And at the bottom, there's the likelihood of the CBR and SBR balance combined remaining below $4 billion is about 50 to 60%. And so that means there's about a 40% chance in the later years that we have reached that $4 billion amount in those funds combined. And then that bottom row is again showing the balance getting to 500 million, which would mean ERA overdraws. And so there's only about a 9% chance in the first few years of requiring an ERA overdraw in these scenarios. And by the end of the period, it's about a 20 to 25% likelihood of needing to overdraw the ERA, according to our scenarios.
Next slide.
Moving on to slide 20. Now we're showing SB 199. And first we're going to show the three different models with the assuming that the trigger succeeds, which means that we assume $800 million of new revenue is instituted in FY27 through the end of the period. So that would just be a flat 800 million added to our baseline revenue assumption each year. And with that, the PFD would be 25% of the POMV draw through FY27, and then beginning in FY28, the PFD would grow to 50% of the POMV. So you can see at the very bottom, the PFD per person is about $1,600 per person in FY27, and that grows to $3,200 per person in FY28, and that's when you see that change in the PFD formula. And so we see surpluses throughout the period. Under these assumptions, the combined reserves balances grows beyond $30 billion, and since there are only surpluses, there's no need for any sort of ERA overdraws or use of the CBR SBR.
Senator Wilson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just the history of the legislature, and this statement comes from a individual that's been around in ledge finance, that when the money is revenues are that significant, the legislature just tends to spend that. So would you, I guess as ledge finance, feel that these numbers just as static, that won't stay static? I mean, obviously the capital budget will change, our operational spend will change, and just didn't know if we had more of a historical ratio of surplus to legislative spending that could be applied to these models.
Through the chair, Senator Wilson, this is Alexi Painter, Legislative Finance. Excuse me. So I think, what we see with the current year's budget is an example of what you're talking about, that the growth is 5%, not 2.25%, and the capital budget's growing significantly. Generally, we've seen, when we had significant revenue in the mid 2000s between FY05 and between starting in FY05 and through FY14, our operating budget grew by an average of just shy of 8% a year. So in times when we've had more revenue, the legislature has often chosen to grow the budget more. That's a policy choice. We can't tell you that you will or will not do so, but the last time we had significant revenue, that was one of the choices the legislature made, was to increase spending. So there were still significant surpluses during that period, but spending also grew faster than inflation during that period.
But to that point, wasn't it true that, I can't give you the percentage, you talked about 8%, but how much of that 8% went to the deferred maintenance capital budget catching up on backlog?
Mr. Chairman, that was just the agency operations portion. So disregarding the capital budget, which, we had capital budgets as big as $2 billion of UGF in one of those years, but just the agency operations grew by nearly 8%, which some of that does go into, day-to-day maintenance, but not necessarily into the deferred maintenance. A lot of it went into, we'd had a nearly, by FY04, we had about 15 years of flat or declining budgets, or declining in real terms. And so there was quite a bit of kind of deferred growth. We're seeing some of that this year, that, employee wages have not increased for several years. So we're seeing, faster growth in the contracts than previous years. And that was seen during that period as well, that, when you hold the budget flat or declining for 15 years, there's a lot of pent-up demand, let's say, for spending.
Senator Stedman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of quick points. As mentioned, that the salary and benefit increases we have throughout all three areas of the branches of government, clearly they're going to, and bonus issues, hiring bonus issues, other things, is getting wrapped up in discussions with the operating budget this year, and we have to make some decisions as a committee. So clearly there's a lot of upward pressure in that regard. And then also in this particular slide, they're using 2.25% inflation. Historically, before we had this flat inflation, roughly decade behind us, the average inflation was 2.5% since the late 1920s. That number was pushed down a little bit because we had a decade of, very minimal inflation. But now we're walking into another inflation spike. And, we're seeing numbers and hearing numbers in the news, 6, 7, 8%. And once inflation goes, it takes off. It's like a fire. It's hard to put out. So it's most likely going to run for several years. So I would, when I look at 2.25% inflation and I look back to 1928 and looking forward, I would say that's a pretty optimistically low rate of inflation that we're going to be walking into the next several years. I hope it's true, but I think it's highly unlikely. And we've got to, I think, take that into account. There's been, my understanding, more money spent on the federal government, printed and spent by the federal government dealing with COVID than there was in defending the country in World War II. So we've got a huge inflation momentum pushing this economy that we're going to have to live with and struggle with here for the next several years, in my expectation. So that's one reason why we asked for slide to show calculation rate higher than the 2.25. We don't know if it's going to be 8% or 7% or 4% or what it's going to be, but be awful optimistic to hope it's going to be 2.25% for the next several years, in my opinion.
Please continue. Slide 21.
I'll turn it back.
Finance Division.
Mr. Bell?
Again, for the record, this is, sorry, I was muted. Again, for the record, this is Connor Bell with Legislative Finance Division. Slide 21 shows the 5% growth assumption. So the same as the prior slide, except assuming that 5% higher growth in agency operations and capital versus the 2.25. And in this scenario, we see strong surpluses through the first several years, but beginning FY28, we begin to see deficits. And those are filled by the forward funding, the K-12 forward funding reduction, that $1.2 billion for the first 2 years. And then for the final 2 years, the CBR and SBR build are filling those $900 and $800 million deficits. There are no ERA overdraws required, and the ending SBR, CBR combined balance is about $8 billion at the end of the period. And again, at the bottom, you can see the PFD per person, which is the same as the prior slide, where it jumps up to the 50% beginning FY28. Oh, and I just note that I think I forgot to note this in the last slide. The on the graph on the left, those orange bars are representing that $800 million annually of new revenues as part of this plan.
Thank you. Please continue.
Slide 22 is showing the SB 199 with that trigger succeeding, so the $800 million in new revenue and the 25% POMV PFD jumping to 50% in FY28, showing that with our probabilistic modeling in FY23, you can see a range of $1 billion deficit to about $800 million surplus. And again, since any revenue over $100 a barrel goes to the permanent fund principal, the maximum surplus is that $830 million. And then after that, you can see 3 years of somewhere between 2.5 to 0 surpluses. And the jump up in FY27, that's because of that's the first year that those $800 million of new revenue is instituted, but the higher PFD doesn't begin until FY28. So that's why the surpluses are higher in that year, because the new revenue has started, but the higher PFD has not. And then beginning FY28, you see a similar range of somewhere between $300 to $500 million deficits and $1.5 billion surpluses or so. So half the cases we saw kind of came out between those two amounts. And on the right, you see that there's only ERA overdraws in about 1 or 2% of cases in each given year. And so this is similar to just assuming no ERA overdraws. This is what the range of realized ERA balances looks like. So there's still some chance of the earnings reserve account going to 0 if we see poor returns, but there's also, a high likelihood of, or a plausible likelihood of it exceeding $20 billion or $30 billion. And there's a high likelihood in these assumptions that the CBR and SBR combined becomes greater than $4 billion. So it's about a 93% chance in the later years that CBR and SBR balance does exceed that $4 billion threshold.
Okay, next slide.
All right, slide 23. This is our last scenario. So we'll be showing the 3 slides for this last model, which is the SB 199, assuming the trigger fails. So no new revenue is instituted, meaning that the PFD is just 25% of the POMV draw for all years. So at the bottom, you can see the PFD per person amount. It's $1,200 per person in FY23, and then growing to about $1,700 per person in FY31. And we see surpluses throughout the period under the 2.25% growth assumption. And so the combined reserves balances exceeds $30 billion by the end of the period, and there's no reserve draw required.
Okay, continue.
Right, now showing this same model with the 5% growth instead of the 2.25% growth. And again, we start to see deficits in FY28, and we still maintain healthy reserves balances. We see about $100 to $500 million of deficits per year.
Senator Von Imhoff.
Thank you. So just putting together these last 2 slides, again, it shows how inflation does affect the long-term forecast. And I think that it's important for this committee to look at the long term, at least a decade, if not a couple decades. And it's the compounding effect of the inflation that does have significant impacts. And again, going back to even the previous, I just have to state for the record, which I've stated a gazillion times, I have a problem taxing people to turn around and pay a dividend. So this, of course, scenario is the trigger fails, which is the taxation trigger. But this bill does have a taxation component to it to pay a dividend. I don't know. So thank you. Thank you for letting me say that, Mr. Chairman.
Please continue.
Thank you. Again, for the record, Connor Bell, Legislative Finance Division. This is our last slide, which is showing the SB 199 with the trigger failing. So the 25% of POMV PFD for all years with the probabilistic modeling. And the median surplus deficit is similar to what we saw 2 slides prior. In FY23 on the left, you can see the deficits range from billion in deficits to 800 million in surpluses. Actually, for the first several years, it's the same as the 3 slides prior until FY27. And since it's the 50-50 PFD the entire time, the range is more similar throughout the period. It's about a balanced budget to a few $100 million in deficits, ranging up to over $2 billion or more in surpluses. In 50% of the cases for each year we saw, there's only about a 1 or 2% chance of the requiring ERA overdraws in this scennario. So that, again, the chart on the right is essentially the same as what we saw three slides prior, because there are no ERA overdraws essentially in these cases.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bell. Any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, I'm going to take a brief piece.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Unpacking what they just had to say there about the SB 199. You can clearly see by the very last graphs that they were showing there, that is what they have currently been doing for the last 7 years. That was a 25-75 split on that last one that they just showed there. And that is currently what they are doing at the moment. That's what their bill looks like. They're both the one that just passed out of the House and the one they're working currently here on in the Senate. That is a 75%, 25% split to where we're only going to see that $1,300 PFD. She says that with this one, she has a hard time wanting to tax people to give us a PFD. Well, here's the simple truth. Follow the statutory PFD law that's written on the books right now. Follow the law, and we wouldn't be having this problem in the first place. You would be doing the right thing by producing a fiscally responsible budget that matches the tax revenue you have coming in. You had a $3.5 billion surplus this year, and instead of using that surplus to put away into savings into the CBR account for next year and the year after that and the year after that, you spent it all, and now you're using that as your excuse to continue to steal our permanent fund dividend. This bill is so dang corrupt, it's outrageous.
He's got staff here. He'll get. Okay, so amendment deadline is Thursday, tomorrow at noon, April 21st, 12 p.m. Amendment deadline. Okay, we'll set the bill aside. Next up is bill number 243, raise power cost equalization. This is the first hearing of the bill. Our intention is here to bill introduction, take public testimony. Set the bill aside. Ms. Shine is here for the bill's introduction. Floor is yours.
Good morning, members of the committee, and for the record, I'm Erin Shine, staff co-chair Bishop and the Senate Finance Committee. So Senate Bill 243 proposes to raise the maximum kilowatt hour available to residential customers for power cost equalization relief from 200 kilowatt hours a month to 700 kilowatt hours a month, 750 kilowatt hours a month. Alaska's PC program was established in 1984 and provides economic assistance to communities and residents for rural electric utilities where the cost of electricity can be 3 to 5 times higher than for customers in more urban areas of the state. The PC program was further established to assist rural residents. At the same time, state funds were used to construct major energy projects to assist more urban areas, as most urban and road-connected communities benefit from major state subsidies on energy projects. Rural communities not on the road system that are dependent on diesel fuel do not benefit from those large subsidized energy projects. PC is a cost-effective alternative to provide comparable rate relief to rural residents. The program reimburses the utility for credits it extends to its customers in those areas. The PC program is funded by earnings of the Power Cost Equalization Endowment Fund, which was established in 2010, which the last market value as of March 31st, 2022 is at about $1.1 billion. And it provides that 5% of the fund's 3-year monthly average market value may be appropriated to the PCE program. In your bill file, you'll find an analysis provided by the Alaska Energy Authority that assumes that if all residents and residential customers can utilize the additional 250 kilowatt hours, SB 243 will add approximately $16 million to the yearly PCE payment. As you may be aware, the percent of market value draw on the PCE Endowment Fund not only funds PCE, but also Community Assistance and Renewable Energy Grant Fund. According to the calculations done by Legislative Finance, it will take about approximately a $320 million dollar appropriation to capitalize the PC Endowment Fund to continue funding these waterfall programs from the POMV draw. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions the committee members may have.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Senator Von Imhoff.
If more money goes towards the power cost equalization, does less money then go to community assistance?
Senator Von Imhoff, Ms. Shine.
Through the chair, Senator Von Imhoff, there is still a statutory program or formula in which it would be, which we would follow, and that's outlined in AS 4245085, and there are certain triggers at which the POMV percent of market value from the PCE fund, if it's over 70% difference between the two, I can submit it to in writing, but no, the money that would go to power cost equalization, that the residential program would go first, and then the waterfall would still happen, but that the fund would need to be capitalized with some additional funding for there not to be a general fund component for those payments.
Follow-up?
So just a clarification, you mentioned waterfall, and that's what I was asking about, is that I understand that the power cost equalization, or you called it the energy equalization, is the first payment to come out of the fund. But if we raise it, which I understand, I mean, it's costly to run diesel in rural Alaska, but there is a consequence of that, in that the trigger and the other items mentioned in that statute may not have the funding for them. Is that correct?
Through the chair, Senator Von Imhoff, I know we have Curtis Thayer online who might be able to answer that question. I believe right now at what the fund is rolling off, it would be fine for the next couple of years, but he might be able to answer that more definitively.
Senator Hoffman, did you want to say anything before we go to Mr. Thayer?
Well, we asked Alexei Painter to come up with a number to keep the program intact, and the number that Ms. Shine mentioned in her presentation to achieve no changes in the program, the other programs would be $320 million.
To keep everything whole?
Yes.
That means $320 million additional, is it not a grant to the PCE fund, like a, is that what you're saying?
To the endowment, yes.
Yes. Right now there's a balance of 1.1 billion. And the 320 would then take that to about 1.4 and change to the endowment.
I mean, I understand that. I know that there's other folks out there looking at different endowments for education and like the Higher Education Trust Fund, and especially if we're going to be paying more in the WWAMI program, they're going to need a higher balance as well. And I know there's floating around this building, the Homeless Trust Fund. I don't know if we want to add money into the Deferred Maintenance Fund. And as you know, the sky's the limit. And I don't know. I mean, it's just something to consider. There's just a lot of competing priorities.
Mr. Thayer, did you have anything you wanted to say? Do you want to wait for public testimony or you want to testify now?
Mr. Chair, I can testify now. In the information that was provided is correct. We anticipate the program would cost an additional $15.7 million a year by going from 500 to 750 kilowatts. There would be no additional administrative cost on AEA's part for administering that program. It would just be a dollar for dollar exchange for the going to 750. A little historical, and that is in the last 5 years, the PCE earnings have ranged anywhere from $48 million to $155 million. This year being 155. And with that, the first bucket of money, so to speak, is the PCE. We budgeted at roughly $32 million, but there's budget language that allows that to increase depending on the true cost. And then you do have the community assistance of $30 million. And the only year that was not fully funded was in FY 2020 when the earnings from the fund was only $48 million. And then there's the cascading waterfall when 70% and you can use up to $25 million for one of three items, one being rural powerhouses, one is being the Renewable Energy Fund, or to capitalize the bulk loan revolving loan fund. And this year we had the $25 million excess, and $10 million we've recommended to the legislature to use for powerhouses, 15 for the Renewable Energy Fund. And so completely funded. So as far as the additional is $320 million, I can't comment on that. That's really a call, I think, for Ledge Finance to identify what that number is. I just know what the earnings have been in the past, and we've had 1 year where it didn't pay it for it all, but we've had several years where it does pay for everything, including the cascading.
Thank you. Senator Hoffman, this 750 kilowatt is not a new idea.
It is not a new idea. That was the original amount of kilowatts that was utilized when the program was initially contemplated.
Thank you. Any other committee discussion? We're going to have an amendment deadline for briefities.
No, I'm just available for questions of it. Like I said, this is really a policy call, but this is not any type. This is something that AEA can easily do. It's just the decision to go to 500 to 750. One thing I will note is we did assume in this fiscal note of $15.7 million that's assuming everybody would use the 750 kilowatts, and that might not be the case. And so this is a very conservative estimate on the high side of what the additional cost would be.
Okay, thank you. Next, Senator Stedman, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you have Mr. Thayer explain what there's a community portion for, non-residential homes embedded in this somewhere. Could you explain how that works and if it's capped?
What thank you through the chair, Senator Stedman. The PCE program is for residential customers only in the PCE eligible communities and for community buildings up to a certain kilowatt. So it is not for commercial buildings or commercial enterprises. And when I say a community building, whether it be the city hall or community gathering hall, it's not necessarily for schools as they have other funding sources to pay for theirs. It is strictly residential only, is for the PCE program. So there's not a third party necessarily receiving benefits from PCE other than community buildings and the residential homes.
Senator Stedman.
Thank you. Well, the concern that has been expressed to me is that one of the choke points is the community buildings. And they seem to, consume more power and maybe need more relief or at least some consideration versus the homes. So can you shed any light on that issue?
Through the chair, Senator Stedman, that has been a concern here with us at AEA. And we're currently undertaking, and has not been done for several years, but we're currently undertaking an audit of all 193 communities to better understand what community buildings they might have expanded or built since the last audit, which was done about 8 years ago, to make sure that number is accurate for those buildings.
Follow-up,
We do have the full data.
Follow-up, Senator Stedman.
Yeah, I guess the point is, when we address this piece of legislation, should that be a component part of it if it's an issue, even though you may not be quite as prepared as you'd like to be? That's the concern. Are we ignoring part of the problem in our rural areas by not addressing community buildings?
Through the chair, Senator Stedman, we do account for community buildings. I think the weakness or the downfall is we don't necessarily. We need to work with the communities to identify what are maybe new or additional community buildings that we don't currently have plugged into the system for PCE. And that's something where communities are supposed to notify us as they have these new buildings or these addition to these buildings. But we're working out and reaching out to every community just to verify, to have a better handle on it. But it's to reach out to 193 communities is going to take most of the summer to reach out. So we recognize that there might be some community buildings that are missing, and we want to add and make sure that we add those into the program.
Thank you, Mr. Thayer. We're now going to go to Big Lake. Mr. Houtling, Bert Houtling at Big Lake, if you're on their phone, could you put yourself on the record in 2 minutes, please?
Hi, my name is Bert Hufftelling. I'm from Big Lake. I represent myself, my child, and about 4,000 other Alaskans out there. I find myself really at odds with the power cost equalization, adding more money into it or increasing what they are going to get. It's unfortunate to see that we are continuing to cater to those who seem to only survive based on what and how much government continues to spend on them. It was clearly reflected in the bill SB 199 that was just previously heard, where the actual true reflection of your guys' will is down there in Juneau. Wish you would quit catering to the minority and the far agenda that is going on down there and start looking at the majority who have been suffering during this pandemic and have critically lost much of what they have lived for here in Alaska. We expected to come to the land of the free and the last frontier. Instead, we find ourselves being stymied and shut down by our government, our own local representatives on where we go into the future. I'm against increasing any funding for the power cost equalization. They have hundreds of millions of coronavirus pandemic money and infrastructure money sitting in their coffers right now to spend. How about they use it to benefit themselves instead of just the minority? Thank you.
All right, seeing no further testifiers, public testimony is closed. Any further discussion before we set a deadline for amendments and set the bill aside? Senator Wilson.
Yes, Mr. Chair, if I could just get more information on sort of the, maybe a 5-year span of increase to power cost equalization, or how this will affect the endowment. I mean, I guess my question was, is it the additional 320 something million that needs to be endowed in 1 year, or is it what Mr. Thayer said is just a $15 million a year increase that the state legislature has to put in? I'm just a little confused on how that will be funded. So maybe just a simple chart or something in that nature of how this will work in sort of financing.
Senator Stedman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's something for the committee to consider. We could, if this bill becomes law, we could build that endowment up over time, over several years. We can do it at a particular trigger price on oil if we want. There's a lot of flexibility in how we get there and when we get there. So that's just something that we need to talk about here at the table and make that decision. The 300 million is a significant amount of money. But I remember one year we put 300 million in Cook Inlet in credits. And got back a canceled check. And that was it. So it is significant, some, but it doesn't, there is flexibility in how we get there. I think we need to make those decisions, or just have those discussions, and make those decisions as we go forward.
Senator Wilson.
Yeah, I guess I'm, if we don't make those endowments, then this would also take away the earnings for those additional programs, those 3 additional programs that Mr. Thayer talked about. And just wondering how that would be affected in terms of if we don't make those payments.
Senator Hoffman.
And I think that is why I would prefer looking at fully funding it and have the committee consider that so that we're protecting the community assistance program and the other programs. I think there's merit to what Senator Stedman says, but to delay it more than 2 years, we potentially would lose focus. The problem unless we come up with a financing package for 2 years or longer, we don't know what the legislature is going to look like in the 33rd Alaska legislature, and we don't know who the governor is going to be. So I think with the funds that we have today, we should give serious consideration funding the endowment at least $300 million. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Take a brief just.
Wow, unbelievable. I do have a wrap up I'm going to do about SB 199 when this is all over. We've got a government, these people sitting here in the Senate Finance right now, that are wanting to roll an additional $300 million into the PCE account. They can't even pay for a proposed budget of the governor's, do a fiscally sound budget that would have left $3 billion or more sitting in their savings account to be able to spend for a rainy day. Just from the proposed budget that came out of the House, they were putting $2 billion away into the savings account that they stolen from our PFD, from the ERA, and not one penny of the $3.5 billion surplus that they got in tax revenue was put away anywhere into the CBR. They spent it. They took all of that money and they completely spent it on frivolous things like we're seeing right here for power cost equalization. Looks like they may be, they're stepping out of the room here real quick, so I'm just going to switch screens here so that I can be on it in front of you. I'm just absolutely floored by what they got going on there in Juneau. It's unbelievable. Their SB 199, let's give you a rundown of how that's supposed to work. The way it starts out is like what we're seeing right now with the current PFD. It would only be around a $1,200 PFD would be all that we would be seeing. And this progressively grows higher under this new statute, SB 199, until it reaches 50%. Right now it's approximately 25%. It's actually a little less than 25% of what our PFD should be. So it progressively is supposed to grow, but for it to be allowed to grow, they have to collect another $900 million in brand spanking new taxes. Oh, they're coming back here, so I'm waiting for my other screen to show it. I'm still listening in on the on-phone conversation, so I'm a little ahead of the game here for what's happening. But it's outrageous what they're doing. Oh, they have started. Oh shoot, looks like we may have lost their volume on that somehow. All right, well, good thing that I didn't lose anything there. They were just literally just closing up this session and what was going on there, so I will switch back screens here. Sorry about that. It was literally nothing more than them gaveling out for this particular committee hearing going on. So let me blow things up just a little bit here. I want to be able to see you guys better than what I am right now. Hi, there you are. Now I can see you a lot more clearer than what I could here just a second ago. So we got SB 199. This is a bill that has been presented by those very people that are sitting in the Senate Finance Committee right now. Bert Stedman, Olson, Wilson, Wielkowski, Imhoff. I can't, my brain's drawing a blank for all of them that are sitting inside that room. Anyways, you know who I'm talking about. These are the Senate Finance Committee members that presented this bill. This wasn't brought forward by anybody else in the Senate. This was brought forward by those in this committee. This is the poison pill, and you see it in what I wrote up above, that this is the poison pill that Stedman and Imhoff had put into this year's budget cycle for changing the statute for the PFD. This eliminates their current POMV draw if it was to pass, the way it is currently written anyways, but it does not get rid of the statutory PFD law. That statutory PFD law will still be on the books. What this does do is rewrite their old PMV law into a new one that kind of addresses the permanent fund dividend, but it has a bunch of carrots that they're dangling out there that have to be achieved if you want to be able to get this PFD. Oh, here's your PFD on the end of the string. There's the carrot we're going to give you. We're going to impose another $900 million in new taxes. So what does that mean when they say $900 million in new taxes? Well, they could raise what it costs for us to buy our gas at the pump, double the gas tax. Well, there's another $50 million of new taxes that they could do to us. They could impose another new stud tax for our road system. So the cost of our tires to be able to buy them increases. They're getting more money. We're paying more to be able to buy our tires to put onto our vehicles so we don't slip and slide on our Alaskan roads during the winter time. There's another $25 million more. Oh man, we got to have an import tax. We're going to add this tax, that tax, all these little nickels and dimes. And it's not what they're taxing for. This money doesn't go into what they name the tax as being. When they say they're going to increase gas tax for what we pay at the pump, that doesn't mean it's going into our roads. This just goes into a general fund, and they spend it willy-nilly anywhere that they want it to go. Unlike the PCE that they were just talking about. It used to be that way for the PCE, but thanks to our Supreme Court and the judicial branch last year dedicating that as now a dedicated account, their money, they can spend it because of the way it was written. Our PFD is not in a dedicated account for decades paying out a statutory PFD, but the power cost equalization is, and they want to give them $300 million more this year. Oh, So SB 199, again, it's a 25-75 split the way it is currently written. So we're seeing a 1200 PFD. This is what theirs is going to give us, unless that carrot gets met, that $900 million in new taxes. So until they get $900 million in new taxes, they're not going to change the formula for the PFD. It will remain at 25%. Hence, what they've done for the last 6 years, year number 7, we are currently in, they're going to do it again. The House has already passed that. The Senate's current budget reflects exactly what the House has written in theirs. They worked hand in hand crafting this budget. It was designed to be set up when they passed it through the House. The Senate had been working in closed backroom doors with them, those on the committee, working in backroom doors with those on the House Finance Committee, crafting this bill so that the both of theirs would align with each other and add in different little caveats, which is kind of like what we're seeing with the power cost equalization here. Here's $300 million more for you. We got to spend that $3.5 billion of extra revenue they have this year above and beyond what the governor's proposed budget was. We got to make sure that money disappears. They also in the Senate have agreed that they're going to do the forward funding too for education. Now this has still got to pass the floor vote to be able to get these other little things added into it. But mind you, SB 199, this is the only committee this bill is being heard in, Senate Finance. This bill was presented and brought forward by the members in the Senate Finance. This SB 199 is not going to go to any other committee to be worked through. They are going to move this one directly to the floor to be voted on. That is why it is so important that you understand what's going on with SB 199. Now, name any time in the last 7 years that they followed the law. Okay, I know. I'll be waiting here until I am literally nothing but a pair of bones before I will get that answer. They won't follow the law. They've proven that. I mean, for the last 20-some years, they have been failing to follow our Alaska laws that they themselves pass. Statutory PFD is the prime example over the last 7 years of them unable to follow the laws. For 20 years, they have failed to pay the longevity bonus to our seniors. This is one of the reasons why my grandma, God rest her soul, moved out of Alaska in the first place. She was no longer going to get her longevity bonus, and she moved back down to the lower 48 to live with extended family that had the means available to that she could still live comfortably off of the retirement that she had. But when they removed that longevity bonus and decided that they were no longer going to follow the law and pay it, she couldn't afford to live here in Alaska anymore and had to leave. And I really do miss my grandma, sweetest woman in the world. And she wasn't rich. She, by all means, you know, she's like most Alaskans. We live hand to mouth. What we earn is what we get. And she earned the retirement that she had. And the longevity bonus was one of the reasons why she was able to continue to live here in the state that she loved until they took that money away. Exactly what they're doing with our permanent fund dividend. They're taking that money away, and SB 199, if it gets passed, will do exactly that. That will help solidify their theft of our permanent fund dividend. Also put in new laws that say they have to have brand new tax revenue, giving them justification to start passing those bills like doubling the fuel tax that we pay at the pump. But mind you, those bills for taxes, they've got carve-outs for the special interest. If you're in the fishing industry, guess what? Don't worry about your fuel bill being doubled. We don't apply it to you. But if you live in Anchorage or you live in Wasilla or Fairbanks, you live on the major road system, guess what? Bend over, you're going to pay it because you're not special enough. You're not one of the special interests that is going to be carved out that won't have to pay for that. Same with the airlines. Mind you, they'll be carved out too. That's what's in the bill. This is the new taxes that Imhoff and them want to raise to get that $900 million to be able to pay us a 50-50 PFD. Imhoff had the balls, the gall, to actually say that she doesn't want new taxes. The people she represents doesn't want new taxes to give us a full PFD. Whoa. Man, I outright say that she just has no concept, is blatantly lying to us all, because the statutory PFD law says that that money is a transfer from the earnings reserve account. Our PFD does not get paid using taxes. So her saying that to pay us a PFD would mean she has to have $900 million in new taxes to be able to pay that with, she's lying to us. She's doing it blatantly, outright lying to us, knowing full well it's a lie. As the saying goes, the more you repeat a lie, the more people believe it to be the truth. They've been repeating this lie now for 7 years. People thinking this is the truth. Mainstream media keeps repeating the lie. People think it's the truth. If you go and look at the laws that we have on the books, it's nothing but an outright lie. The law states that our PFD is a transfer from the earnings reserve account, and our dividends are paid from that transfer, not from Alaska state taxes. So SB 199, you need to be contacting every single legislator down there in Juneau that are in the Senate right now. All of those on the Senate Finance Committee, they need to be receiving phone calls and emails on a daily basis. Everybody that is sitting in the Senate, period, needs to be receiving phone calls and emails daily telling them hell no to SB 199. It is an extremely corrupt bill, and they know it, and it's never, ever, ever should make it past the floor vote. It should be an outright no. That should be almost a unanimous no coming from the Senate. One of the few times that we should be seeing that. But again, this bill was brought forward by those in the Senate Finance Committee and nobody else. This bill is only going to be heard in the Senate Finance Committee, and then it is going to be put on the floor for a vote before they even put the budget onto the floor for a vote. Why? Because this bill is in line to the budget that they just got done passing in the House, the same budget that they're going to be trying to pass inside of the Senate, the same budget that they have pushed on us for 7 years now. And if they pass SB 199, this will give them justification for their theft over the last 6 years. This new law writes into language as a law that this is how the theft is going to continue to happen. Suck it up, Buttercup, you Alaskans. Bend over. We don't care what you want, what you need. We don't care how many of your businesses were bankrupt over the last 2 years. We don't care how many of you have still yet to find full-time employment because employers are no longer hiring full-time jobs. I could find you a part-time job in a blink of an eye. How many do you want? There's hundreds and hundreds of them here in Alaska for part-time. Show me where the full-time jobs are. You wonder why people are not going back to work. They can't find full-time work. I know this for a fact. Mainstream media won't say that. They're just saying, oh, people are just holding out for more money. No, they're holding out for full-time work. When you got hyperinflation going through the roof, your gas prices at the pump have doubled. You got the Biden gas tax that's continuously killing us out there at the pump because he shut down all production in the United States and handed it over to Putin and Iran and Venezuela and places in Saudi Arabia. All these terrorist countries, corrupt oligarchs, totalitarians, and this is what they're doing to all of us, and they're saying, well, you got to suck it up, pay for that at the pump. When you're working a part-time job, over half your paycheck goes just into your gas. Most people, I would say 25% or less of their paycheck is used just in transportation costs every single day to get them to and from work. Now, then that's based on a part-time job. So if you're going to work part-time, you're only working 4 hours, 25% of that paycheck just went into just paying for the gas for you to even get there. And if you're only working part-time, that other 75% you got is pennies. I mean, making $15 an hour, that's 60 bucks. $15 of that went out to your gas tank. The other 45 before taxes is left. And this is what you get to live off of. Because they're not working full-time hours because the employers out there are not hiring full-time. They're hiring part-time. It has been going on for a very long time. It got exacerbated because of the pandemic. All these new regulations that they put into place. Nobody wants to pay health care benefits anymore. That's what happens when you triggers up to full-time. Some of these businesses got so many people working for them that they already are paying through the nose trying to keep up with all these benefits that are required when you hit full-time hours. So why pay full-time? Why give you full-time hours? We'll continue to keep hiring part-time people and paying them part-time wages and never have to give the extra benefits to them because they never work a full-time job and it never triggers what the federal government has put into place that keeps driving the cost of living up for each and every single one of us. SB 199 is exactly that. It does nothing to look at the future outcome of what the fiscal budget of Alaska will look like. What it does show is how much money, much more money, they can continue to spend. Why would they be showing us, here's what SB 199 would look like if we got it up to 50-50 split, which the $900 million in new taxes would get, and why did they spend the time showing us another budget that only showed it being at 25% perpetuously, endlessly in time? And that 25% is a gradual increase. We're not seeing 25% under this bill now, and we wouldn't see 50% unless they get $900 million in new taxes. And what they do increase it by progressively every single year is never would ever reach more than 25%. And that's exactly what the goal and the intent of those that are sitting in Alaska's legislators right now, Alaska and Juneau, those in the Senate Finance Committee, that's what this bill is all about, is to make sure that they have an endless supply of revenue to pay their special interest. $1.2 billion of extra tax revenue to pre-fund, forward fund in the future, K through 12. Get that through your head, $1.2 billion. Their graphs today, while they were talking about it, showed that $1.2 billion being spent in the consecutive years from now on everything else but education. See the poison pills they've put into play? They have a $3.5 billion surplus and they want to spend 1.25 or 1.2 billion more to forward fund, binding next year's legislators to a payment that they did not agree to. You can't do that under the Constitution of Alaska, and that is against the law, and they know it, and they know that it's going to be defeated in the courts if it even if it makes it past the governor's desk. I see this being a veto, but they've already spent it in the budget, so it already shows off of the books during their current budget process. And you know, God giving that they will not call a special session to go back in, not during an election year, to override any of the vetoes that the governor does to the budget. They'll just use that as campaign fodder against them to say, hey, look, the governor really doesn't care about any of you. I don't care about you at all. Look what the governor did. Look at the governor vetoed that forward funding to K through 12. He doesn't care about teachers. He doesn't care about the education of your children. Just ignore all the critical race theory that we've got running rampant through our schools. Just ignore that men can now be in the sports competing against our young ladies and women that are there in our schools. Who cares that we like all of that stuff? Look at what the governor did. He cut that back out of the budget. He just doesn't care about you. Oh man, sorry. my bleeding heart just is so overwhelmed by that. It hurts. It really does hurt. So SB 199, again, that's a 25-75 split. It more solidifies what they've been doing for the past 6 years, year number 7 right now. This bill is going to be put onto the floor prior to the budget actually being voted on. They want to push this bill through because if they do, then that makes it that much more easier for the budget that they want to have passed this year, because that's in line with what SB 199 has in it. And it will help justify stealing the permanent fund dividend from here on out, because it's written to reflect what they've been illegally doing over the last 6 years now, year number 7. Okay, I'm done breaking down for today. I really do need to get to work. I've ignored my phone now. It's rang twice since I've been doing this in just a short period of time. Please like and share this video. Go to my website, Politadick.com. Click that support button. All proceeds go right back into making sure that I can afford to pay for the restream services that you can watch this on YouTube, Twitter, and on Facebook all at the same time, which is what we're broadcasting on right now. And please, once again, like and share this and go to the website, show your support. I want to continue to keep doing this, but I'm not a rich person. I mean, you guys have all watched me growing up, and we have hit our 5-year anniversary as of 2 days ago. We are officially 5 years old. 3 days ago. We are officially 5 years old for Politadick. We have been on the air now for 5 years, reporting the news here in Alaska and around our great state and around the United States. And we want to continue to keep this coverage going, and it takes supporters like you to make that happen. So please go there, click that support button, and help us grow. Like and share this video so more Alaskans learn about what's going on down there in Juneau about SB 199 and this extremely corrupt bill. Contact your senators in the Finance Committee and throughout the entire Senate. All 20 of them need to be receiving phone calls and emails telling them hell no to SB 199 and also hell no to their current budget. They need to go to the fiscally responsible budget that the governor proposed and stop spending the $3.5 billion surplus that they have before it is gone and it's too late. Thank you guys all for being here today. And again, like and share.